Let's go and see what we can learn today. Now, I am sure that all of you read chapter 6 before you came to class this morning. But we're going to surprise you, and we're going to talk about chapter 6 and chapter 7 today. They're both very short chapters, so we're going to go that route. In case somebody did not read this chapter, I'll start out the same way Larry did. The story is told about an old man driving a wagon along a country road to town to go to market. Well, as he was going to town, he passed this old man on the road walking, carrying a heavy burden. I don't know what the burden was, he didn't say, but he was laden down. And so the man with the wagon stopped and offered the man a ride, and the old man with a load on his back, he graciously accepted, crawled on the back of the wagon. Well, they were going on a few more minutes, and the fellow that owned the wagon that was driving, he turned around to see if everything was okay, and the old man was still on the wagon and so on. When he looked around, the man was there, sure enough, but he didn't take the load off of his back. He was still sitting on the wagon, but he still had that big load on his back. How many Sabbath keepers are like this old man? That they got a ride, they accepted the Sabbath, but they're still carrying the burden of not being free on the Sabbath. Wow. Well, now,
that reminds me of Pilgrim's Progress.
yeah, similar. Well, in previous weeks, we looked at the 10 Commandments that we find in Exodus chapter 20. Well, now, over in Deuteronomy, the commandments are repeated. And we're going to look at, well, let's just see what it says in Deuteronomy. Boy, it starts out pretty much the same as it does in Exodus. I'm on page 66. Those of you who want to look at the book, or you can look at the screen where it says, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Well, we had a lesson way back in the beginning where we talked about that. Because the Lord your God has commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or your maidservant, nor your ox or your donkey or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may not, as you do, may rest as you do. And now, that was pretty much the same as it is in Exodus. But here, Moses adds a little bit. He says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Well, now, this last phrase gives us a new incentive for keeping the Sabbath. The first part, as we said, was identical to what we found in Exodus. keep the Sabbath day as a holy day, and do not do any work on do not do any work, you or anybody or anything that's in your household. Now that's a pretty good stretch there. Who all does that include? Everybody in your household. No comments, huh?
You and my dog doesn't work on the Sabbath.
You and your dog,
My dog does not work on the Sabbath.
you've trained him that way.
That's right, he rests. Of course, he rests the 6 other days of the week, so it's not really much of a difference.
Do you feed your dog on the Sabbath?
Not personally, though, I leave that to my children.
But they're working,
They're working on the Sabbath, that's right.
and it says not your son nor your daughter.
My dog likes to eat on the Sabbath, though.
It does.
I noticed you said thing, you included thing, no thing. Does that include in, say, an electric motor?
I give up. Well,
You included all the people and you said no thing, nobody and no thing should do any work.
maybe I should take that back. And what do you think?
Well, I put the electric motor to work. I did do the work of plugging it in or turning it on.
Well, again, we have to realize that back then, of course, they didn't have an electric motor, but to keep warm, they had to go out and gather up wood or whatever to burn. Today, we don't have to do that. All we do is go over and turn the thermostat a little bit, and bingo, we've got heat. So,
And a herd of elephants.
And I heard it all once.
things are different today. And so, we're talking about a little different thing this morning. We're going to discover a new reason for keeping the Sabbath, for resting on the Sabbath day. We remember that God rested on the Sabbath day. And for that very fact, there's a lot of people that keep the Sabbath simply because God rested on the Sabbath. There are other people that keep the Sabbath for other reasons. Today, we want to look at a different aspect of keeping the Sabbath. We can, of course, identify with God on all of these reasons why we keep the Sabbath. And you remember a few weeks back, we went around and asked the people why. I believe that was maybe the first week. We asked you, why are you here? Why do you keep the Sabbath? And there was a lot of answers that day, but not even one answer that I was looking for, that I wanted to hear. But anyhow, today we're getting another reason for keeping the Sabbath. Remember. He does a lot of things, remember. So these things are really not new. God is telling us to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Now, what does that have to do with the Sabbath? Since he's saying, remember, you guys were slaves in Egypt. They were, as a slave in Egypt, they were forced to work every day. 7 days a week they made bricks. They loved to throw one of them at Pharaoh, but they were slaves. They had a slave driver over them, make sure that they worked all day long, 7 days a week. And if there were ever a 7-dayer, they were, when they were in Egypt, making bricks for Pharaoh so that he could build Egypt into a better, mightier place. So, in slavery, there's never a day of rest. There is no Sabbath day when you are a slave. But God is saying here now, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Okay? Then he goes on to say, remember that God brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Don't forget that, you guys. Remember that that's what did. The exodus from Egypt is probably the greatest thing that the children of Israel ever experienced. Yes, they opened up the Red Sea and they brought water out of they did a lot of good things God did for them. But the deliverance from Egypt was the thing that God wanted them to remember. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And now you're free.
Amen to that.
We're going to see how great that is. The story of the Exodus would serve as the defining moment of the God of Israel and the faith of the Israelites. This all goes together. God delivered them, and he saw to it, he trained them. He went to, what school did we go to? The Saudi Arabian Vocational Training School out there in the desert. That's where he taught them about the Sabbath. Now he's telling them, don't ever forget, you guys, that you were once slaves in Egypt and God brought you out, and now you are
Free.
free. Okay, that's the word, and that's what we're talking about today. You are free, and that means a lot in Sabbath keeping.
You're free for what?
Okay, you're free. If you had to work all day long, 7 days a week for all of your life, and you were set free, you were free to do what? Well, come on now.
Worship God.
If you were slaves in Egypt, and you were working day in, day out, with no let up, and these slave drivers working on you all day long, and all at once you were no longer slaves. You were free. And as a slave that was free, you would be glad to do what?
Rest.
Rest. Okay.
Stop working.
So they were free now to rest. And he says, therefore, God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Remember, people of Israel, that you were slaves, but now you are free. Now, as free people, you are able to rest, not for a couple of minutes, not for an hour to just take a break, but you are free. And you are free to rest for a whole day. The Sabbath day. Wow. Think what that would have meant to those children of Israel who were slaves, working their hearts out, and all at once they are free. They were free to rest. Wow. by resting on the Sabbath, Israel affirmed their freedom. Resting on the Sabbath was a joyful proclamation that God had delivered them from bondage. Wow, that's a long way to go from being a slave to being free.
Pastor
Okay?
Chuck? Pastor Chuck?
Yeah,
I don't know if you're gonna get to this, but I read there's two things that they're supposed to remember in that phrase. And the first was that they were to remember they were slaves, but the second was to remember that the Lord brought them out with a mighty hand and outstretched arm.
yeah.
And so it seems to me that it's important that the command to observe the Sabbath day hinges on remembering both of those things. So it's not just that they were free to not work, but there's a connection with God is the one that was setting them free. And so there's a connection there with the Lord. So it seems to me like there's a couple of reasons there that are embedded. I don't know if you're going to focus on that or not, but it just hit me that there were two.
So don't forget that you were slaves and it was God that brought you out of Egypt. It was God that performed the miracles of the Red Sea and getting water out of a rock and the manna. All of those miracles were God in action. Because, as we will see, God promised them that He would take care of them out there in the desert. He would supply every need that they had. Well, they needed food. Did God supply the food? They needed water. Did He supply the water? How about clothing? Did He supply clothing?
Clothes never
Okay.
wore out.
Didn't wear out, so He supplied every need that they had. So remember, it was God that brought you out of Egypt. You are free. You are free to rest on the Sabbath. And don't you ever forget, it was God that provided all of these things for you.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember because we can be free and use that freedom to forget that it was God that brought us that freedom, and that instead of being belonging to Him, many people can use freedom to essentially do their own will instead of understanding that that's God and that He's providing for them in their freedom as much as in their slavery. It's the Lord that's the provider. I think that's an important thing. I like what you say, a proclamation that God delivered them. That resting on the Sabbath and not working is actually a proclamation that God is our provider.
And Jesus, so many people, when we talk about, oh, that was for the Old Testament people, that's not for us today. But Jesus, time and again, reinforces these things. And we have a story that we're going to look at today, how Jesus reinforced this thing. Now, it was on the Sabbath day that this happened. And Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, He called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then He put His hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, "There are 6 days to work, so come and be healed on those days and not on the Sabbath." And the Lord answered him, "You hypocrite, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and take it out and give it water? Then should not this woman, the daughter of Abraham, when Satan has kept her bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" Now, it's interesting in this passage, you get the story. You know what's happened here. But Jesus uses a couple of words here that I think are very significant to what we're talking about today. Look at that. How many times does it use the word free, bound, etc.? So here again, Jesus is using the phrase free and freedom for the Sabbath, so that she would be free to rest on the Sabbath, certainly just like the Israelites of years and years ago. Moses was telling them they were set free from Egypt, they were set free to follow and serve the Lord because He was their provider. He provided them with everything. They didn't lack a thing. Anything they needed out there in the desert at that vocational training school, God would provide for them. And that in itself is an amazing thing. And in so doing, He was telling them, you remember all of this, and especially when the Sabbath day comes and you can collapse, you can rest. We're going to talk a little more about that after a while too.
You know, the Lord didn't provide Wi-Fi in the desert. I'm just pointing that out.
He didn't?
He didn't provide Wi-Fi. No cell phone coverage in the desert.
Well,
We don't know that.
They didn't have wires. They didn't have phone lines, so it must have been wireless.
The signals may have been there. Nobody just knew because they didn't have phones.
Now, the reason He didn't provide them with Wi-Fi out there in the desert is because He promised them that He would give them everything they needed. Not everything they wanted, but everything that they needed out there in the desert, God would provide for them, and He did. So forget the Wi-Fi. Thank you, buddy.
You're welcome. Here all day.
Let's see, let's do another one here. Oh, yeah. How many of you know this fella? Paul Manuel. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He used to be here, and he's, of course, now in Pennsylvania. He's not doing too well. What's he have? MS. Yeah. MS, and he's homebound, almost chairbound. But he was a good fellow, and he did a lot, and what does it say? Oh, here it is. Are you at liberty to rest each seventh day? Paul Manuel challenges us with the question, if you are not setting this day aside and resting on Sabbath, it's because you are still under bondage. You are enslaved to the world's system. So the writer here is telling us that we have been set free. So it's time to forget all of the things of the world. Forget about your job. Forget about bringing any thing in from the fields to provide for yourself or your family on the Sabbath day. We are to rest on the Sabbath. But there are a lot of things that still enslave us, even so you're saying, wow, yes, we want to keep the Sabbath. But let's look at what does enslave you, what makes you a slave. We can become trapped in our work, enslaved in our environment. Now, others are burdened by debt or held captive by addictive behaviors. Boy, many people are held bondage in unhealthy relationships. In many cases, we are held in bondage because of bad choices that we have made. Whose fault is that? But in every case, Satan enjoys the opportunity to keep us enslaved, to keep us from resting, totally resting on the Sabbath. When we keep the Sabbath, it's a deliverance, a liberation. It's like an Independence Day. How do you observe the 4th of July? Just because we have been set free. God is saying, you have been set free. We are given the privilege of rest. Are you taking advantage of that? Okay, here it is. And it says, God has delivered us. You and me. Just like the children of Israel were delivered from being slaves in Egypt, you and I have been delivered. We have been set free, just like the children of Israel. We have been set free. God has delivered us. Christ has redeemed and saved us. So, say hallelujah to that. Each Sabbath day we stop our work and enjoy the day of rest. We are remembering our salvation. We are affirming our freedom in Christ. Now, that says a lot. We are remembering our salvation. Can you remember the day that you were set free? The day that you accepted Christ? The day that He said He was going to provide your needs?
Yes.
Sabbath day is a day of remembering. Remember what God did for you. Yes, Nate.
So the Israelites, they were slaves and they worked 7 days a week. And God said, remember you were slaves. And there's a connection between their work on the 7 days. What you're doing is applying this to our salvation. And so the question comes up, what's the work that we've been doing beforehand? Because in a salvation application, it's not physical labor that we're resting from. And I think we need to talk about this a little bit more. If we're to remember our salvation, it's not the same remembering that the Israelites were doing because they were forced as slaves to work on the Sabbath and God gave them a rest from that work. It's a little bit different. So I think we need to talk about, as Christians, what that means for us when we remember the Sabbath day because God's delivered us. What exactly is the work that He's delivered us from?
It delivers us from the oppression of sin. It's not work, but it is slavery.
Slavery to sin.
When God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, He promised that He would provide everything that they needed. Well, in God's mind, they needed to not only enjoy it physically, but they needed to enjoy their deliverance, their salvation in a spiritual way. And He began to teach them that by means of the Sabbath day, that they were to depend upon God. We're going to talk about that in a minute here, but they were being trained to trust God for their physical needs and enjoy God in their spiritual life. Okay?
You know, I think there's more here, Pastor Chuck.
Okay, go for it.
Because there's work that we do to try to make ourselves good enough in God's eyes. And you know, Hebrews is pretty clear on this. We're entering eternal Sabbath rest. We're not working to make ourselves acceptable to God. There's nothing that we can do ritualistically, keeping the Sabbath, whatever it is. We can't make ourselves good enough in God's eyes. And so I think what we rest in a different way. And the Israelites certainly had that spiritual application, but God was talking about their physical rest. I think when we remember this, we have to remember that Jesus did the work for us for salvation. And so Sabbath keeping, resting from work, we should also not just rest from physical labor, we should remember that nothing that we have done makes us worthy of salvation. That Jesus did that all, and we don't have to work to make ourselves good in God's eyes. This is the work that I think, spiritually speaking, that we should remember in Sabbath keeping today as believers. Because it's different. It's different than the Israelites had, even though there's some similarities but you know, the comparison is, hey, there's work that we've tried to do to make ourselves good enough, and we can't do it, and Jesus did that for us. I think that's an important point in Sabbath keeping, and I think that's something that we miss a lot because we focus on the physical work and resting a lot. And I think that we need to bring that into our manner of thinking about the Sabbath as well.
It's the work of self-righteousness.
The work of self-righteousness. Yeah, absolutely. That's what we have rested from.
That's right.
Good, thank you. In the wilderness, the children of Israel had to come face to face with one of the most basic questions, and that is faith. Okay? Can we trust God for our needs? Can we believe that God will take care of us and supply us with everything that we need? Do we have enough of faith in God's providential care that we will go so far as to not even do anything to provide for ourselves on the Sabbath? And that goes a long way. Can we trust God for everything on the Sabbath day? Are you thinking? When they use the word everything, can you trust God for everything? Can you lean on Him and enjoy the Sabbath in your spiritual life? Boy, That says a lot. Can we leave our work, our gathering in, our producing, our income gathering, boy, our money making, all of the things that we might do to earn personal and economic well-being.
I think that's tough.
Abandon it all and totally trust God.
I think it's a challenge.
It is.
I think it's a big challenge.
More so in our day, even I think, than it was in their day. They were out there in the wilderness and they had little competition with God as He began to teach them. Today, hey, everything on every hand is battering us and trying to keep us from keeping the Sabbath. I believe it's much more of a challenge today than it was back then. So,
One of the challenges I find with keeping the Sabbath is you can not work on the outside, but on the inside,
yeah,
you are still under pressure and you're thinking through things and it's going through your mind. And to me, that's even more of a challenge. You know, for someone that's used to keeping the Sabbath, you know, has been doing it for a long time, you're on autopilot, right? You don't work on the Sabbath. But, although I actually do. That's kind of weird. But anyway, but it's that in your mind when you're thinking about things and and you're holding on to those things. That's, I think, some pressure that people have a hard time letting go of. You know, kind of the unwinding part. That's tough to let go of things.
I did. I violated that this morning.
Yeah, you're thinking through stuff to
86% of your
do.
life is spent on the other 6 days, and
That's right.
to disconnect, it's hard to not pick that up again.
Yeah.
so what we do on Sabbath afternoon when we're resting, that we're, the Sabbath will be over and then I can go to town. I can do this, or I can
Yeah.
we're ruining the Sabbath right there. And we're trying to cut it short, which we do sometimes, and fudge a little bit. But hey, it's like this. When I got out of the Army, and I had a pretty soft job in the Army, and so when I got out, I was looking for a job, and I found a job working for a contractor, and he was building this warehouse. They were already up 2 stories, and they had to go up, I think 3, or I believe it was 3 was gonna finish it off. But anyhow, they were on the 3rd floor. Well, there wasn't any floor, we were just building walls at that time. And my job was to mix the mud and to carry the blocks. Nothing to it. Well, I soon learned that the mud, the mortar, is pretty heavy. Especially when you had to carry it up 2 flights, well, not stairs, but gangplanks up, and dump it up there. And then the blocks, they weren't using little blocks, they were using big 12-inch blocks. I think they weighed about 80 pounds each. Well, I did this all day, and when I went home that night, I was tired, completely exhausted. I went to my bed and just laid out flat. I needed the rest. That's what God wants us to do on the Sabbath. Let everything else, forget about it all. I am just resting in Him. And I'm forgetting about carrying blocks. I want to just rest. And that's what God is telling us, that we need to just rest. Let's see here. It says here, you no longer had to hold on to an aching back or a weary back. Okay. When you take the day off and God says you're to rest, you learn to rest on the Sabbath. What do you think about on the Sabbath day? If you're resting from all your physical labors, He doesn't want you to think about working or working tomorrow even. He doesn't want you to do anything that's providing for yourself. So here I am, I give myself to the Lord for the Sabbath day. I want to rest in Him. Ponder how good He has been to you, how He has supplied your needs. We can compare that to a newborn baby. A baby, what all does it supply for itself? Zero. Zilch. Nothing. Everything is provided for this baby, for his comfort. If he needs food, it's supplied for him. If he needs his pants changed, he doesn't do that. All he does is squeal a little, and it happens. Everything is supplied for this baby. Can we be like a little child? Can we be in that kind of a mindset in our relationship with God, like a little baby, and allow God to supply everything that you need on the Sabbath day? Then I knew this fellow that decided that since God would provide him with everything, he was not going to work at all. He quit his job, as a matter of fact. God will provide. Well, yes, God will provide on the Sabbath day, but He also says that you're to work the other 6 days. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord, and on it you do no work. Now, if we can,
I look at it as the 6 days' work are focused upon our livelihood, the things that are really centered in the world. On the Sabbath day, we have opportunity to concentrate on spiritual things in worshiping and honoring God, so that it is truly His day. It's not just physical rest, it is honoring God in all that we do, all that we think, and all that we say. And that's the primary difference, in my opinion.
I think the one leads to another. if we can, well, if we start with the physical rest, and we do as God commanded and forget about everything on the Sabbath day, then our minds are open to visit with the Lord. But you cannot visit with the Lord while you're thinking about what am I going to do as soon as the Sabbath is over, or all of the other things that we consider or think about. God has promised us peace, peace of mind, peace in your heart. If we will just let go and let Him have our Sabbath day. That's really not very much. We have 6 days, and we give Him 1 day. Do we really give it to Him? That's our question.
Chuck, you said we must work 6 days?
That's what it says. I didn't say that. God did.
Mm-hmm.
So we couldn't rest another day if we wanted to.
Or 2 more. What
I
about
mean,
that?
a weekend is 2 days off work. So on Sunday, we should work as well, is that what you're saying?
We usually do. Maybe not for wages at our job, but we're working, we're cutting the grass, we're working in the garden, we're repairing the
Yeah.
spouting on our
I
house.
hear you, but we must work on Sunday?
God says, 6
or
days
Wednesday,
thou
or-
shalt work.
Okay.
And I
On
think-
Sunday, we don't do as much work.
What's that?
Wives do. On Sunday, we can take out the garbage and that's good,
Yeah.
or whatever.
He doesn't say how much work, but whatever you do on the Sunday then, would undoubtedly be providing in one way or another for you or your family. You do a lot of chores around the house. If you don't, your wife will get on your back and you'll be doing them. But it may be a different kind of work.
I'm in a situation where my Sabbath is on Saturday and Kathy's Sabbath is on Sunday. So I'm in a unique situation.
You call that being in the middle?
No. It's good,
It's good, okay.
but we worship on 2 days and,
I don't think God would have a problem with that. As long as you don't take 7 days off. Then, if you took 7 days off, then I think the Lord would quit providing so much for you and make it to a situation where you had to go to work. Okay? Now, how did the provision of manna teach the Israelites faith? Taught them that there was not going to be any manna on the Sabbath day. But how did the provision of manna teach the Israelites faith?
Well, there were 2 sides to that coin. during the week, they had to have faith that there would be more manna the next day, so not to store up any overnight that would become wormy. And then on Friday into Sabbath, you had to have faith that it would be good the next day, that God would allow the manna to stick around overnight.
And when they finally learned after a couple of weeks that there wasn't gonna be any food on Sabbath night, that you better go out, it was teaching them faith, it was teaching them obedience. They were learning a lot. And more importantly, they were learning who it was that made this happen. How come? Manna on 6 days but not on the Sabbath. Who does that? Who sends that manna? Who makes our clothes so they won't wear out? Who gets the water from the rock? They were learning to trust their God. They were learning to be obedient to His commands. Okay? Next question. How does resting on the Sabbath reflect our trust in God's provision? You sure are a talkative class today. Okay, next question, and the last one. Okay. Are there times when you have trouble experiencing a carefree, childlike rest as described in our lesson so far? If so, why? If not, what is your secret of a happy, contented life?
The concerns of the world always crowd out our dependence upon the Lord.
Too many times. No comments, no questions, no nothing. Well then, that's all, folks.